The morning sun hadn't quite cleared the treetops yet when she pulled into the airport parking garage, the kind of early that still felt like night if you hadn't had coffee. Her uniform was pressed, shoes polished, and the weight of her flight bag, packed with charts, checklists, and her FAA license, felt familiar against her shoulder. She'd flown this route a dozen times before. Same plane, same crew, same routine, or at least it was supposed to be. She walked through the terminal with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent years earning her place in a world that hadn't always made room for her. People glanced, some out of curiosity, others out of habit. But she kept her eyes forward, focused on the gate number blinking on the overhead screen. Flight 427 to Denver. Boarding in 20 minutes. As she neared the jet bridge, a young gate agent stepped into her path. He looked barely out of college, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the crowd like he was hunting for something specific. When he saw her, his expression shifted, not quite suspicion, but something close. A flicker of doubt. "Can I help you?" he asked, voice polite but edged with caution. She smiled slightly, used to this dance by now. "Captain Reynolds," she said, holding up her crew ID. "I'm flying today." The agent glanced at the badge, then back at her face, then down at his clipboard again. He didn't take the ID. "Are you sure you're with the crew? The pilots already went through." "I'm the captain," she said, keeping her tone even. "I just got here." He hesitated. "Because?" "The other pilot, the captain, he's already on board." She blinked. "There's only one captain scheduled for this flight." "That's me." Now he looked flustered. He turned to a colleague behind the counter, whispering something. The second agent, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Linda, leaned over. "Ma'am," Linda said, not unkindly but with a firmness that carried weight. "We were told the captain was a man. Maybe there's been a mix-up?" "No mix-up," she replied, pulling out her FAA airman certificate along with her company ID. "This is me. I've flown this aircraft type for 8 years. I've been with this airline for 6. Linda studied the documents, then handed them back slowly. "Okay. But just to be safe, let me call the cockpit." Before she could respond, the agent picked up the intercom phone and dialed the flight deck. She heard him say, "Hey, is the captain up there yet?" A pause, then, "Yeah, okay. Got it." He hung up and turned to her. "They said the captain's already on board. Maybe you're on a different flight." She felt a tightness in her chest, but she didn't raise her voice. "There is no other captain. If someone's in that cockpit claiming to be in command, that's a serious issue. I need to get up there. Now." At that, a few passengers waiting nearby turned their heads. A man in a business suit frowned. A woman holding a toddler shifted her weight, watching closely. The tension was subtle, but it was there, like static before a storm. Linda sighed, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, I don't want any trouble. But we've got procedures. If there's confusion, we can't just let anyone walk onto the plane." "Anyone?" The word hung in the air for a beat too long. She didn't say it with anger. She said it quietly, the way you might repeat a word you didn't quite believe you'd just heard. But the implication was clear, and everyone within earshot felt it. The gate agent flushed. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" she asked, still calm. "Because I'm standing here with valid credentials on time, ready to do my job. And I'm being treated like I'm trying to sneak onto a plane." A flight attendant passing by, someone she'd flown with before, stopped short. "Captain Reynolds? Is that you?" Relief washed over her for a split second. Recognition, normalcy. "Yes," she said. "And I'm being blocked from boarding my own flight." The flight attendant's eyes widened. She turned to Linda. "That's definitely our captain. I saw the crew list this morning." Linda looked from the flight attendant to her, then back again. The clipboard trembled slightly in her hands. I didn't realize." "It's fine," the captain said, though it wasn't. "Just let me through." She walked past them toward the jet bridge, but the delay had already done its damage. By the time she stepped into the aircraft, the cabin was half full. Passengers watched as she made her way forward, some curious, others indifferent. But she could feel the weight of the moment, the unspoken question hanging in the recycled cabin air. Why was she stopped? Inside the cockpit, the first officer, a man she'd flown with a few times, looked up from his checklist. "Hey, everything okay? You're a few minutes late." "Gate issue," she said, stowing her bag and slipping into the left seat. She ran her hands over the controls, familiar as an old friend. They didn't believe I was the captain, he paused. Seriously? She nodded, already flipping through the pre-flight paperwork. Yep. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then quietly, that's messed up. She didn't respond. Not because she disagreed, but because she was already shifting into pilot mode, checking fuel levels, reviewing weather, scanning the maintenance log. There wasn't time to dwell, not now, but the sting remained, tucked beneath her professionalism like a splinter she'd deal with later. As the cabin door closed and the jet pushed back from the gate, she taxied onto the runway with steady hands. The engines hummed, the tower cleared them for takeoff, and the plane lifted smoothly into the sky. Below, the city shrank into a patchwork of lights and streets. Up here, everything made sense. Clear rules. Defined rules. Physics you could trust. But even as the ground fell away, the memory of those seconds at the gate stayed with her. Not because of the embarrassment, she'd faced worse, but because of what it represented. It wasn't just about one confused gate agent. It was the assumption that a black woman couldn't possibly be in command of a multi-million-dollar aircraft. That she must be mistaken, lost, or worse, pretending. She'd spent years proving herself in simulators, in stormy crosswinds, in red-eye flights over empty oceans. She'd logged thousands of hours, passed every exam, earned every stripe on her shoulders, and still someone could look at her and see anything but a pilot. The flight climbed to cruising altitude. The first officer handled the radio while she ran through the next set of checks. Everything seemed normal until it wasn't. Flipping open the aircraft's maintenance log, she noticed something odd. The last entry was dated 3 days ago, but the plane had flown 4 sectors since then. No new entries, no sign-offs. That wasn't just sloppy, it was a violation. FAA regulations required a log entry after every flight, especially if any issues were noted. She frowned, flipping back a few pages. The handwriting changed abruptly 2 weeks ago. The usual mechanic's neat script vanished, replaced by rushed, almost illegible scrawls, and several inspection stickers on the cockpit panels, normally bright and current, looked faded like they hadn't been replaced in months. Her stomach tightened. She glanced at her co-pilot. Did you notice anything off with the pre-flight inspection this morning? He shrugged. Not really. Ground crew said everything was good. But you didn't do a walk around yourself? I was running late, he admitted. Figured they had it covered. She nodded slowly. It happened. Everyone cut corners sometimes. But this felt different. The missing log entries, the expired stickers, the rushed paperwork. It all pointed to something bigger, something systemic. As the plane leveled off over the Midwest, sunlight streaming through the windshield, she made a quiet decision. She wouldn't let this go. Not this time, because being doubted at the gate was one thing. But if corners were being cut on safety, on the very thing that kept 150 people alive at 35,000 feet, that was another matter entirely. For now, she'd fly the plane. She'd land it safely in Denver. But the moment her feet touched the ground, she'd start digging. Not out of anger. Not for revenge. But because someone had to speak up, especially when no one else would. And maybe, just maybe, this time her voice would be heard. The flight settled into its rhythm somewhere over Kansas, engines humming a steady drone, passengers dozing or scrolling through screens, the occasional clink of ice in a drink cart. Up front in the quiet bubble of the cockpit, the captain kept her eyes on the instruments, but her mind was already miles ahead, circling back to the gate. The hesitation in the agent's voice, the way her credentials had been met with doubt instead of respect. She'd flown through worse. Turbulence that rattled your bones, crosswinds that tested every ounce of skill. But this sat differently. It wasn't just about her. It was about who got to be believed, who got to lead, and who got questioned just for showing up. She shook it off as best she could. Flying demanded presence. Distraction could cost lives, so she focused on the task. Monitoring altitude, checking fuel burn, listening to air traffic, control, routine, reassuring. Then came the checklist. They were running through the mid-flight. Systems review when she noticed it, a small inconsistency. In the hydraulic pressure readings, not alarming. Not enough to trigger a warning light, but off just enough to catch her attention. She double-checked the numbers against the pre-flight report. The numbers didn't match. Did you see this? She asked, pointing to the screen. Her co-pilot glanced over, squinted, then shrugged. Might be a sensor glitch. These older birds act up sometimes. She didn't answer right away. She'd heard that phrase before, older birds, used to excuse everything from sticky throttles to flickering lights. But this airline's fleet wasn't that old, and sensor glitches didn't usually line up with missing maintenance logs. She reached for the aircraft's technical logbook, the thick binder kept in a side pocket of the cockpit console. Flipping through, she found the last official entry, a routine inspection signed off by a mechanic named R. Patel. But the signature looked rushed. And the date 3 days ago was the same one she'd seen earlier. Yet the plane had flown daily since then. No new entries. No notes about recurring issues, nothing. That wasn't normal. Not even close. In a properly run operation, every flight would generate at least a brief log entry. No defects reported or minor issue resolved. If something needed follow-up, it got flagged in bold. But here, silence. Like the plane had been flying ghost missions untouched by human hands. She turned a few more pages back. 2 weeks ago, the entries were detailed, thorough. Notes about a faulty oxygen sensor, a minor leak in the left landing gear strut. Both fixed, both documented with part numbers and test results. Then suddenly the entries got shorter, sloppier, then almost non-existent. "What's going on with maintenance?" she murmured more to herself than to her co-pilot. He glanced up from his tablet. "Budget cuts, probably. They've been pushing us to turn planes faster. Less downtime, more flights." She nodded slowly. She'd heard the rumors. Whispers in crew lounges about reduced staffing and maintenance, overtime denied. Pressure to sign off planes even when issues lingered. But hearing it and seeing proof were two different things. She decided to do a deeper scan. While her co-pilot handled radio calls, she ran through a series of manual system checks, things the computer didn't always catch. She tested the backup flight controls, verified the emergency generator, checked the weight and balance sheet against the actual passenger and cargo load. That's when she froze. The manifest listed 142 passengers and 3,200 pounds of cargo. But the weight and balance calculation in the flight plan didn't match. It showed a lighter load, closer to 130 passengers and 2,500 pounds. That discrepancy might seem small, but in aviation, small errors could snowball. An incorrect center of gravity could affect how the plane handled during takeoff or landing, especially in an emergency. She pulled up the digital load sheet on her screen. The numbers there matched the manifest. But the paper copy tucked into the flight folder? Different. Someone had manually altered it. Not with a pen. Someone had printed a new version with adjusted figures. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't just sloppy paperwork. This was deliberate. And dangerous. She looked at her co-pilot. "Did you review the load sheet before takeoff?" He hesitated. "I glanced at it. Seemed fine. You didn't notice the numbers were off?" "I trusted the dispatcher," he said a little defensively. "We're always in a rush." "You know how it is." She did know. The pressure to stay on schedule was real. Delays cost money. But safety wasn't supposed to be negotiable. She took a breath. "We need to document this." "All of it," he frowned. "Document what?" "A few mismatched numbers. They'll just say it was a clerical error." "Maybe," she said. "But what if it's not? What if this is happening on other flights too?" He didn't answer. He just looked out the windshield, jaw tight. The rest of the flight passed in a kind of tense quiet. She kept flying smoothly, professionally, but her mind was racing. She thought about the passengers behind her, families, business travelers, people who trusted that the people in the cockpit knew what they were doing, that the plane had been properly maintained, that every rule was being followed, and what if they weren't? By the time they began their descent into Denver, the sun was dipping low, painting the Rockies in gold and purple. The approach was textbook, clear skies, light winds. She landed the plane with barely a bump, taxiing to the gate with practiced ease. As the engines wound down and the seatbelt sign clicked off, she stayed in her seat a moment longer than usual. Her co-pilot unbuckled and stretched. "Long day," he said. "Yeah," she replied. "But it's not over." He gave her a look, part concern, part warning. "Be careful what you dig up." "I'm not digging," she said quietly. "I'm just reading what's already there." She gathered her things, making sure to take the original paper load sheet and a copy of the maintenance log. Back in the crew lounge, she found a quiet corner and plugged her laptop into the wall. She logged into the airline's internal safety reporting system, the one every pilot was trained to use if they spotted a potential hazard. She started typing. Not an accusation. Not a rant. Just facts. Missing maintenance log entries for 4 consecutive flights. Discrepancy between digital and paper load sheets. Expired inspection stickers observed in cockpit. Inconsistent hydraulic readings not documented. She attached photos she'd discreetly taken with her phone. Blurry but clear enough to show the faded stickers. The mismatched numbers. Before hitting submit, she paused. She knew how this could go. Some pilots filed reports and never heard back. Others got labeled troublemakers. Careers stalled. Schedules changed mysteriously. She'd heard stories. But then she thought about the gate agent's eyes. How they'd narrowed when she said she was the captain. How quick he was to assume she didn't belong. Maybe that moment had been about race. Maybe it had been about gender. Or maybe it had been about something deeper. The unspoken belief that someone like her wouldn't notice the cracks in the system. That she'd be too busy just trying to prove she deserved to be there to see what was really going on. Well, she saw it and she wasn't staying quiet. She clicked, submit. The confirmation screen popped up. Your report has been received. Thank you for helping keep our skies safe. She closed the laptop and stood up. Outside, the Denver evening was cool and crisp. She walked to the crew shuttle, her flight bag heavy not just with gear, but with the weight of what she'd just done. Back at her hotel, she ordered room service, just a salad, nothing fancy, and sat by the window, watching planes land and take off under the stars. She thought about calling someone, a friend, a mentor, but who would understand? Most of her pilot friends were men who'd never been stopped at the gate for looking wrong. And the few women she knew in the industry? They'd all learned to pick their battles. But this wasn't just her battle. Because if the airline was cutting corners on maintenance and paperwork, it wasn't just her safety at risk. It was everyone's. She opened her email. No response yet from the safety department. Not that she expected one so soon. She scrolled through news sites instead, half expecting to see nothing. But then a headline from a regional aviation blog. Whistleblower pilot grounds flight over safety concerns. It wasn't about her, not yet, but it was close enough to send a chill down her spine. Someone else had spoken up, and they'd been heard. That gave her hope. She turned off the light and lay down, exhausted but wired. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faded inspection sticker, the altered numbers, the gate agent's uncertain face. She wasn't just a pilot. She was a witness. And witnesses had a choice, look away or speak up. She'd made hers. Tomorrow she'd fly back home. Same plane maybe, same crew. But she wouldn't be the same person who walked into that terminal this morning. Something had shifted. Not in her skills, those were solid, but in her understanding of what her role really meant. It wasn't just about flying the plane, it was about making sure the plane and everyone on it was treated with the care it deserved. And if that meant challenging a system that preferred silence over truth, then so be it. She finally drifted off just before dawn, dreaming not of runways or clouds, but of clear, honest records, of gate agents who smiled and said, "Welcome aboard, Captain," without a second thought. When her alarm went off at 5 a.m., she got up without hesitation. There was work to do. The morning after landing in Denver felt different, not because of the weather. It was clear and dry, the kind of autumn day that made you forget you were in an airport city, but because of the quiet hum of anticipation under her skin. She'd filed the report. It was done, official, in the system. No taking it back. She dressed slowly in her hotel room, folding her uniform with care, checking her bag twice. Not out of nerves. She'd flown through storms that would rattle anyone, but because something had shifted. She wasn't just flying a route anymore. She was watching, listening, noticing. At the crew briefing, the mood was light. Coffee flowed. Jokes bounced around about last night's delayed inbound flight. Someone complained about the hotel Wi-Fi. She smiled when appropriate, answered questions about the return leg, but kept her observations to herself. No point raising alarms before she had more than hunches. Still, as they walked to the aircraft, she scanned the tarmac with new eyes. The ground crew moved quickly, almost hurriedly, dragging hoses and stowing gear. One mechanic gave the plane a quick once-over with a flashlight, then nodded to the ramp supervisor. That was it. No clipboard. No detailed walk-around. Just a nod. She filed that away. Back in the cockpit, she opened the maintenance log again. Overnight, a single line had been added. No defects reported. No name. No signature. Just those 4 words typed in a generic font, printed and slipped into the binder. That wasn't how it was supposed to work. Every entry needed a licensed mechanic's signature, wet ink or verified digital, along with their employee ID. This was a placeholder, a formality with no substance. She took a photo, quietly, discreetly. During pre-flight checks, she tested the same hydraulic system that had shown odd readings the day before. This time the numbers looked normal. Too normal, like someone had reset the sensors or masked the issue temporarily. She made a note. Hydraulic pressure stable. Verify post-flight. The flight back was smooth, uneventful. Passengers chatted, slept, watched movies. The co-pilot handled most of the radio calls and she let him. She needed to think. By the time they touched down at their home base, late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the taxiways, she knew she couldn't rely on the airline's internal system alone, not if the paperwork was being faked, not if maintenance was being rushed or skipped. So instead of heading straight to the parking garage, she went to the operations office and asked to speak with the chief pilot, a veteran with 25 years in the left seat and a reputation for fairness. He listened without interrupting as she laid out what she'd seen, the missing logs, the altered load sheet, the unsigned maintenance entry. She didn't mention the gate incident. This wasn't about that. This was about safety. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "You're sure about this?" "I've got photos," she said. "And I'm not the only one noticing things." He sighed. "Look, corporate's been under pressure. Fuel costs are up, competition's fierce. They've been pushing hard on efficiency. Efficiency shouldn't mean cutting corners on safety," she said gently. "I know," he admitted. "But sometimes, people look the other way to keep things running." She held his gaze. Until something doesn't run, he didn't argue. Instead, he opened his laptop and pulled up the airline's internal audit logs. "Let me check something." He typed for a few minutes, then frowned. "There have been 3 other safety reports filed in the last month on this same aircraft type. All flagged low priority. None escalated." Her stomach dropped. "By whom?" 2 first officers. 1 flight attendant. All cited maintenance delays and incomplete documentation. Were they investigated? He shook his head. Closed as administrative error. No follow-up. She sat back, the pieces clicking into place. It wasn't just one plane. It wasn't just one oversight. This was a pattern, and someone was making sure it stayed buried. That night, she didn't go home right away. She drove to a quiet diner near the airport, ordered tea, and pulled out her laptop again. This time, she didn't log into the airline system. She went to the FAA's public safety portal, the one any pilot, passenger, or concerned citizen could use to report potential violations. She started a new report. More detailed this time. She included dates, flight numbers, specific discrepancies, and the photos. She didn't accuse anyone by name. She stuck to facts. But she made it clear, this wasn't a one-off mistake. It was systemic. Before submitting, she hesitated. Once this went to the FAA, it was out of her hands. The airline would be notified. There'd be questions, investigations, possibly grounding of aircraft, and possibly backlash. She thought about her career, the years of training, the student loans, the solo cross-country flights in rickety trainers, the first time she'd landed a jet in heavy rain and walked away feeling like she'd finally earned her wings. All of it could be at risk. But then she thought about the woman in 32B on yesterday's flight, the one who'd smiled when she saw a black woman in the cockpit, like it meant something. And the little boy who'd pressed his face against the window during takeoff, eyes wide with wonder. They didn't know about load sheets or inspection stickers. They just trusted that the people in charge knew what they were doing. That trust had to mean something. She hit submit. 2 hours later, her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered. "Captain Reynolds?" A man's voice asked. Calm, professional, but with an edge. "Yes. This is Director Hayes from Corporate Safety. We received your internal report, and we've also been alerted to an external filing with the FAA." Her breath caught, but she kept her voice steady. I felt it was necessary. We'd like you to come in tomorrow morning. 8 a.m. Conference Room B. We need to discuss the situation. I'll be there, she said. He paused. Just so you understand, filing an external report without exhausting internal channels first, that's a serious step. I exhausted them, she replied. Nothing happened, another pause. Longer this time. We'll see you tomorrow. The call ended. She sat in her car for a long time, engine off, streetlights flickering on outside. She wasn't scared, not exactly. But she was aware. Aware that speaking up could cost her. Aware that some people would rather silence the messenger than fix the problem. Still, she slept better that night than she had in weeks. The next morning, she arrived early. Conference Room B was on the third floor of the airline's headquarters, a sleek glass building that always felt more like a tech startup than an aviation company. Inside, 3 people waited. Director Hayes, a woman from HR she'd never met, and a man in a suit who introduced himself as legal counsel. No pleasantries. No coffee offered, Hayes got straight to it. Your FAA report alleges multiple regulatory violations. That's a big claim. I reported what I observed, she said. With evidence. The HR woman leaned forward. We understand your concerns, but have you considered that this might be perceived as retaliatory, given the incident at the gate? The word hung in the air like smoke. She looked at them one by one. Are you suggesting I made this up because I was embarrassed at the gate? No one's saying that, Hayes said quickly. But timing matters, and optics matter. Safety matters more, she said evenly. If a plane isn't maintained properly, it doesn't care about optics. It just fails. The lawyer cleared his throat. The FAA may launch an audit. That could ground half our fleet, cost millions. Jobs could be lost. I'd rather lose a job than lose lives, she said. Silence. Then Hayes sighed. We'll look into it, internally, discreetly, but we strongly urge you to withdraw the FAA report. I can't do that, she said. It's already in their system. And honestly, if you were truly committed to safety, you'd welcome the scrutiny. He didn't answer. She stood. Unless I'm being grounded, I have a flight tomorrow morning. I'd like to prepare. They let her go. Outside, the air felt lighter. She hadn't won, not yet, but she hadn't backed down either. That evening, she got a text from a pilot she barely knew, a woman who flew cargo on the weekends. Heard what you did. Thank you. Then another. Be careful. They're watching. She didn't reply. But she saved the messages. Over the next few days, small things changed. Her schedule was adjusted. No long-haul flights, just short hops. Her usual co-pilots were reassigned. In the crew lounge, conversations stopped when she walked in. Not hostile, just careful. She kept flying, kept documenting, kept her head up. Then on the 5th day, an email popped up in her inbox. Not from the airline, from the FAA. Subject, Preliminary Inquiry Case. Yarifei 2025-8840. She opened it with steady hands. The message was formal but clear. Based on her report and corroborating data from other sources, the FAA was initiating a targeted audit of the airline's maintenance records, crew documentation practices, and weight and balance procedures. The investigation would begin immediately. She read it 3 times. Then she closed her laptop, walked to her balcony, and watched the sunset. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. There'd be pushback, denial, maybe even attempts to discredit her. But the truth was now in motion. And once the FAA got involved, the airline couldn't just file it away as administrative error. She thought about the gate agent again. Maybe he hadn't meant harm. Maybe he'd just never seen a black woman captain before. But his doubt had opened a door, one she hadn't planned to walk through, but now couldn't ignore because sometimes being told you don't belong is the very thing that reminds you why you do and why you have to stay. The first sign that things were changing came not from the airline, but from a stranger. It was a Tuesday morning, and she was grabbing coffee at the airport cafe before a short turnaround flight. She kept to herself these days, headphones in, eyes down, trying to avoid the sideways glances and hushed conversations that followed her through the terminal. But as she reached for her cup, a woman in a mechanic's jumpsuit stepped in front of her. "You're the one who filed the report, aren't you?" the woman asked, voice low but firm. She hesitated. "I filed a safety concern, like any pilot should." The mechanic nodded, then glanced around before pulling a folded piece of paper from her pocket. Take this. Don't open it here. Then she walked away, disappearing into the maintenance hallway before there was time to respond. Back in the crew van, she unfolded the paper. It was a handwritten list, dates, tail numbers, and brief notes. Hydraulic leak ignored. OCT 2, oxygen system not tested. SEP 28, weight sheet altered. OCT 4. At the bottom, a single line. We've been scared to speak up. You gave us courage. Her hands trembled slightly. This wasn't just one plane. It wasn't even just one base. This was happening across the system, and people on the ground knew it. She tucked the note into her flight bag like a secret weapon. That same afternoon, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Not corporate this time, a journalist. Hi, I'm writing a piece on aviation safety culture. Heard you might have insights. No pressure, just coffee off the record. She almost deleted it. She didn't want headlines, didn't want to be a story, but then she thought about the note in her bag, about the pilots who'd filed reports and been ignored, about the passengers who boarded planes every day without knowing what went on behind the scenes. She typed back. One condition. You talk to the mechanics too. This isn't just about me. They met 2 days later at a quiet diner far from the airport. The journalist was older, with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers. Someone who'd covered airlines for decades, not chasing clicks but chasing truth. They talked for 2 hours. She didn't exaggerate, didn't dramatize, just laid out what she'd seen, what she'd documented, and what others had quietly confirmed. She didn't ask for anonymity. If I'm going to say it, she told the journalist, I'll say it with my name attached. But protect the others. They risk more than I do. A week later, the article dropped. It didn't scream scandal. No all-caps headlines or grainy photos. Just a calm, detailed piece titled Paperwork Gaps. Silent alarms inside an airline's safety blind spots. It quoted unnamed mechanics, referenced FAA records, and included her account, verified with documents and timestamps. It didn't accuse the airline of malice, but of a dangerous kind of complacency, prioritizing schedules over standards, silence over scrutiny. Within hours, it was shared across aviation forums, picked up by national news outlets, and, most importantly, forwarded to the FAA's Enforcement Division. Then the dam broke. First, a senior first officer from another base reached out. I've got logs from 3 different aircraft showing the same missing entries. Want them? Then a flight attendant messaged. Last month, we were told to skip the emergency equipment check because we were running behind. I have the audio from the intercom. Even a retired dispatcher emailed. I left because I couldn't watch them cut corners anymore. I kept copies of altered load sheets. I'll send them. It wasn't a flood. It was a steady, quiet stream of people who'd stayed silent for too long and now, finally, felt safe enough to speak. The airline's response was swift, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of denying everything, corporate issued a carefully worded statement. We take all safety concerns seriously and are fully cooperating with the FAA's ongoing review. No mention of her. No acknowledgement of the report. Just polished corporate language designed to calm investors, not passengers. But behind the scenes, the mood shifted. In the crew lounge, people started making eye contact again. Not all of them, but enough. A veteran captain she'd never spoken to before nodded at her in the hallway and said, Good on you. A young first officer slipped her a note that read, You reminded us why we got our licenses. Still, the pressure was real. Her schedule changed again, this time to mostly reserve status, meaning she was on call but rarely assigned. Not officially grounded but sidelined. Corporate called it operational adjustments. She called it what it was, isolation. Then came the meeting, not with safety, not with HR. This time it was the VP of Flight Operations, a man with silver hair and a handshake that felt like a warning. He didn't waste time. You've caused quite a stir. I reported what I saw, she said. You went outside the chain of command. The chain wasn't working. He leaned forward. Look, we're not monsters. We want safe flights too, but you've put us in a tough spot. The FAA's auditing 20 of our aircraft. If they find violations, we could lose our operating certificate for those planes. Do you understand what that means? Grounded planes, she said. until they're fixed. And lost revenue, layoffs, maybe even route cancellations. I'd rather have grounded planes than crashed ones, she replied. He studied her for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he sighed. 10 years ago I would have done the same thing. She raised an eyebrow. What changed? Responsibility, he said quietly. Not just for safety, but for thousands of jobs, families, pensions. It gets messy. I'm not asking you to choose between people and profits, she said. I'm asking you to choose between doing it right and pretending. He didn't answer, but when she left, he didn't stop her. That night, she got a call from her union rep. They're not going to fire you. Too much attention now. But they might try to push you out with performance reviews or schedule harassment. We're watching. Thanks, she said. But I'm not going anywhere, because something unexpected had happened. The more the airline tried to minimize her, the more others stepped forward. Pilots from other airlines reached out with support. Aviation safety advocates shared her story, with permission. Even a few passengers emailed, saying they'd chosen this airline because they believed in accountability, and now they were watching closely. Then came the FAA's preliminary findings, not public yet, but leaked to a few trusted sources. And the journalist called her again. They found it, he said, on 6 aircraft. Missing maintenance sign-offs, altered weight documents. One plane had a known issue with its anti-skid braking system that hadn't been logged in over a month. She closed her eyes. How many flights? Over 80 flights. Thousands of passengers, all trusting that the system worked, while the paperwork told a different story. The FAA didn't wait. They issued an emergency order, ground the affected aircraft immediately. No exceptions, no delays. The airline complied, publicly. Privately, the fallout was chaos. Flights canceled. Crews stranded. Executives scrambling, and through it all she kept flying. Short routes, quiet cabins. But every time she walked through the terminal, she held her head a little higher, because the truth was out. Not as a scandal. Not as a personal vendetta, but as a necessary correction, a reminder that in aviation, cutting corners isn't efficiency, it's gambling, and the stakes are lives. One evening, as she waited for her shuttle after a late flight, a young woman approached her. She looked nervous, clutching a flight attendant training manual. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Are you Captain Reynolds?" "Yes," the woman's eyes lit up. "I saw the news." "What you did?" "It matters. I start my first flight next week, and I was scared to speak up if I saw something wrong. But now I think I will," she smiled. "Good, because your voice matters too." The woman thanked her and hurried off, but the moment stayed with her. This wasn't just about violations or audits. It was about culture, about who gets to be heard, about making sure the next generation doesn't have to choose between keeping their job and keeping people safe. The backlash hadn't disappeared. The sideways looks still happened, but now they were mixed with something else: respect, quiet nods, small acts of solidarity, and that, more than anything, told her she'd done the right thing, not because she wanted to be a hero, but because someone had to be honest, and sometimes honesty starts with one person refusing to look away, even when it's easier to pretend everything's fine. She got on the shuttle, tired but clear-eyed. The sky was dark, but the runway lights were bright. And somewhere out there, another pilot was about to make their first solo flight, believing, because of moments like this, that they too could belong in the cockpit. That was worth every uncomfortable meeting, every changed schedule, every silent hallway. Because real safety isn't just in the manuals. It's in the people who refuse to let it slip away. The morning the FAA released its final report, the sky was the kind of clear blue that made flying feel like a gift. She read the findings on her phone while waiting for her pre-flight briefing, sitting on a bench outside the crew lounge with a paper cup of coffee going cold in her hands. The language was dry, full of regulatory codes and technical terms, but the message was unmistakable. The airline had violated multiple federal safety regulations. Maintenance records were falsified or missing. Weight and balance documentation had been altered without authorization. Required inspections had been skipped or improperly logged. 6 aircraft were cited specifically, fines totaled in the millions, and most significantly, The FAA mandated a complete overhaul of the airline's internal safety oversight system, starting from the top. She didn't cheer, didn't smile, just closed the browser and took a slow breath. It wasn't victory, it was accountability, and that was enough. Inside the briefing room, the mood was different than it had been just weeks before. No one avoided her eyes. No one whispered when she walked in. Instead, the lead captain, a man who'd flown for the airline longer than she'd been alive, nodded at her as she took her seat. "Good work," he said quietly. Just 2 words, but they carried weight. Later, as she walked toward her aircraft, something else had changed. The gate agents didn't hesitate. The ramp crew gave her a crisp salute. Even the flight attendants stood a little straighter when she entered the cabin. Not out of fear, out of respect. She settled into the left seat, ran through her checks, and taxied out without incident. The flight itself was uneventful, smooth air, clear skies, routine radio calls. But as she lined up on the runway, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: peace. Not because the battle was over, she knew better than that, but because she'd done what she could and it had mattered. When they landed, she was called into a meeting she hadn't expected, not with legal, not with HR. This time it was the airline's new chief safety officer, a woman brought in from outside the company, someone with a reputation for integrity and zero tolerance for shortcuts. She offered her a chair, poured 2 cups of tea, and got straight to the point. "We're rebuilding," she said, "from the ground up. New protocols, independent audits, a confidential reporting line that goes straight to my office, no filters, no retaliation." She paused. "And we need people like you on the oversight committee. Pilots who've seen the gaps, who care enough to speak up." She didn't answer right away. "Why me?" "Because you didn't do it for fame. You didn't leak to the press first. You followed procedure twice before going external. That tells me you're not looking to burn the place down. You want to fix it." She thought about it. Joining the committee meant staying inside the system she'd challenged. It meant working with people who'd tried to silence her. But it also meant having a real voice in shaping what came next. "I'll do it," she said, "on one condition. Name it. That mechanics, flight attendants, and junior crew have equal seats at the table. Safety isn't just a pilot's job." The chief safety officer smiled. "Consider it done." Over the next few months, change came slowly, but it came. The airline grounded 8 more aircraft for overdue inspections. They hired back maintenance staff they'd let go during budget cuts. They implemented digital logs that couldn't be altered without a traceable audit trail. And for the first time, frontline employees were invited to monthly safety forums. No managers present, just open conversation. She flew less during this time, splitting her schedule between the cockpit and committee meetings. Some pilots teased her gently. "Going corporate on us?" But most understood. They'd seen what happened when no one spoke up. Now, they wanted to make sure it never happened again. One afternoon, while reviewing a new checklist draft, she got a call from the journalist who'd written the original piece. "They're doing a follow-up," he said. "Want to be part of it?" She hesitated. "Only if it's about the changes, not me." He agreed. The follow-up story ran a month later. It didn't focus on scandal. It focused on solutions, how the airline had become a case study in turning crisis into reform. It quoted mechanics who now felt safe reporting issues. It highlighted the new anonymous hotline already used dozens of times, mostly for small things like missing fire extinguisher tags or unclear signage. But those small things, the article explained, were how big disasters were prevented. She didn't appear in the photos, but her words were there, woven into the narrative. Safety isn't a policy. It's a culture. And culture starts with who gets listened to. Back at the airport, life settled into a new rhythm. She still got occasional stares, some curious, some wary, but the gate incident stopped. The first time she walked up to a jet bridge and the agent simply said, "Good morning, Captain." Without a second glance, she almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was normal. And normal was what she'd always wanted. One evening, after a long day of meetings and a short flight, she found a package at her door. No return address. Inside was a framed photo, black and white, taken from the tarmac. It showed her walking toward a plane at sunrise, uniform sharp, flight bag in hand, the cockpit door just ahead. On the back, someone had written, "You belong here." She hung it in her office. Months turned into a year. The FAA's oversight continued, but the violations dropped sharply. Passenger trust, which had dipped after the news broke, slowly climbed back, fueled not by marketing but by transparency. The airline even started publishing quarterly safety summaries online, something almost unheard of in the industry. She kept flying, still loved it, the hum of the engines, the quiet focus of cruise altitude, the precision of a smooth landing. But now, when she walked through the terminal, she noticed other things too. A young black girl pointing at her and saying, "Mom, that's a pilot." A new higher flight attendant asking thoughtful questions about emergency procedures. A mechanic giving her a thumbs up as she passed the hangar. These were the real victories. Then came the invitation, not from the airline, from the FAA itself. They wanted her to speak at a National Aviation Safety Symposium on building inclusive safety cultures. She almost said no. Public speaking wasn't her thing. But then she thought about all the people who'd sent notes, emails, quiet words of thanks. About the young woman in training who'd said, "Now I think I will speak up." She said yes. On the day of the talk, she stood at the podium in a room full of pilots, regulators, engineers, and crew from every corner of the industry. She didn't tell her whole story. She focused on the lesson that safety thrives when everyone, regardless of rank, role, or background, feels empowered to say, "This doesn't look right." Afterward, people lined up to talk to her. Not for autographs, for advice, for hope. One older pilot, his uniform covered in stripes, shook her hand and said, "I wish I'd had your courage 20 years ago." She smiled. It's never too late to start. Back home, she returned to her regular schedule. The next morning, she arrived at the gate for an early flight to Chicago. Same routine, same focus. But as she approached the jet bridge, something small happened. Every crew member on the ramp, pilots, attendants, ground staff, paused what they were doing. Not to stare, not to whisper, but to stand a little taller as she passed. Not because she was special, but because she'd reminded them that their voices mattered. She stepped into the cockpit, closed the door, and ran through her checklist. Outside, the world kept turning. But inside that quiet space, something had shifted for good. She wasn't just flying a plane anymore. She was helping build a sky where everyone, no matter who they were or what they looked like, could trust that the people in charge had done their job right. And that, more than any headline or report, was why she kept coming back. Because flying wasn't just about getting from one place to another. It was about making sure everyone made it home.